The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Jim Raffel with ColorMetrix Technologies, and I'm going to be your guide today for the webinar showing you how to use our ProofPass G7 software along with the SAi RIP to create G7 compliant profiles. And they're pretty cool profiles because what they will do is they'll allow you to improve color consistency, color matching between printers and substrates, and matching of reprints of a job over time. So this is kind of highlighting the difference between canned profiles and custom profiles and showing you that custom profiles are not so hard to make. Hold on a second here. There we go. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to show you that ProofPass, our ProofPass software can be your nozzle check for color. And what we mean by that is that you wouldn't come in on a Monday morning and start up your inkjet equipment and not run a nozzle check to make sure that you're printing well. And essentially this is just going to be a color check. So like a nozzle check, it's going to be a color check, and it's going to give you a pass or fail status, which we'll talk about more as we go on. Before we get to that, just want to let you know who I am again, Jim Raffel. I'm a color management consultant and the CEO of ColorMetrix Technologies. Basically, I went to RIT many years ago, founded this company a little over 20 years ago. We focus primarily on cloud-based cross-platform software solutions and color management consulting. So we've added my G7 expert status through Idealliance and color management professional last year. And so I spent a great deal of time out in the field helping, probably about 40 weeks a year, helping people do color management work. All right, let's get into a few basics about this webinar before we get started. You're all going to be muted throughout the webinar. You may have been on meetings and such where you're allowed to talk. For expedience sake, we're gonna keep everyone muted, but we welcome questions. If you've never used GoToWebinar, if you look at this little screenshot we've got, the questions panel might be minimized right now. If you click on that little arrow, it's going to maximize your questions area, and you can type a question in there, and Shelby, who's on our staff, will alert me that we've got a question that probably needs to be answered. There's also a chat window. We do not monitor that. If you want to chat among yourselves, feel free, but we do not monitor that during webinars. And then we'll also make use of the poll question functionality within GoToWebinar. And I'm actually going to do that right now. Because you guys now know a little bit about me, I'd like to learn a little bit about our audience. So I'm going to put our first poll question up. And you should see a question right now that's asking if you own a spectrophotometer. And if you could simply provide us with an answer, that would be fantastic. And I will then share the results with the entire group. We usually give people about 30 seconds to get these answers in. So we got about 10 seconds left. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to answer. 2 more seconds if you haven't answered. All right, I'm going to close the poll, share some results with you. Okay, so it looks like about 40% of you have a spectrophotometer and 50% do not. And a small percentage don't know what one is. We're not going to cover that in this webinar. I'm just going to say very quickly that it's an instrument for measuring color. And if you go to colormetrix.com, click on the webinars link in the upper right corner, we do have webinars that talk more about spectrophotometers. All right, let me close that poll. I have a second question I want to ask you guys. And this one is, have you ever made a custom profile? So I'm assuming that for some of you, that's going to be a no if you don't own an instrument, but maybe you just don't currently own an instrument. So it'll be interesting to see these results. Again, I'm going to give you, same as last time, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. We've got about 10 seconds left if you haven't had a chance to answer yet. And I'm going to close the poll out and share the results with you. All right, so wow, a little over half of you have had the opportunity to make a custom profile. So some of this will make more sense to you than perhaps the people who've never done it. But we're going to try and keep it as simple as we can and kind of at a 10,000-foot view so it's not too complicated for anybody. And nobody fell for our social media profile question. Okay, our answer. Awesome. Okay, so let's kind of jump back into this presentation now that we know a little bit about each other. So like the nozzle check that I talked about that involves, printing a test and evaluating it for pass or fail, your color check is really the same thing. You're going to print a control strip through your RIP, and you're going to then evaluate that using our software with the spectrophotometer. And for those of you who didn't know what one is, there's sort of a picture of one there. That silver device that looks like a big mouse in the picture is a spectrophotometer. So what you'll do is you'll measure the control strip with that, and then that will give you a pass or fail status based upon the measurements. And that's how we do a nozzle check for color. And if you get a fail, you need to take corrective action. The question becomes, how do you take that corrective action? Well, first you have to understand what the process control circle looks like here. And essentially you've got the calibration piece, which we're going to talk about using the G7 methodology. And then you've got verification, which is what we just talked about. And then process control, as long as you've taken the time to do a verification, doing process control is really almost automatic because the data is going to get put into a database, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the corrective action really revolves around adjusting that calibration. So before we've ever created an ICC profile, and you'll see this actually with the SAi RIP in a few minutes, we've created a baseline calibration that, using our software, it essentially goes in place of the built-in linearization routines in SAi. And we can then reset that calibration. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we would do that in a second. Well, what do we calibrate to, if we're not going to use the built-in linearization of the RIP? Well, I would argue that we'd want to calibrate to something called G7. G7 is a specification that's put out by Idealliance. It's based upon the CGAT's I just forgot the standard number. It's based upon a international, a U.S. standard called CGAT's TR0115-2013. And what it is it's a known good print condition, and it's based upon gray balance that takes the substrate white point into consideration. So the other cool thing is that gray is the one color that we can all kind of look at, and we can say if it's right or wrong simply by looking at it. So when grays appear correct, if they're in matching, grays appear correct if they're in a matching viewing environment. In other words, the white points are consistent. And if you want to learn more about that, idealliance.org/G7. It will give you very, very detailed information. That's a site they just launched in the last couple months that's very up to date and much easier to navigate than what was there in the past. So if we talk about a known good print condition and our nozzle check for color, if we look, there's actually two prints on this slide, and there's one that's laying on top of each other and is kind of shifted to the upper right, and then the underneath one is on the lower left. And you can see that the one on the underneath, the lower left, the picture of the woman and the boats, they're very skewed towards like a blue-green, and the one above it has got a very nice neutral gray. So the known good print condition, or G7, is the sheet on top. And the thing is, that's a set of published numbers. So once I hit that, I can make corrections to hit it again and again and again. And both these sheets do not have an ICC profile in place. These are simply calibrated and or linearized without profiles. So you can see that even without a profile, you can get very good, pleasing color. I don't necessarily recommend that. It's something called G7 Extreme, and it's for a whole different webinar. But it does show you that you get good, pleasing color without even using an ICC profile. So how do we do that? Well, basically going back to the first print that was blue-green, we measure some control strips, and we generate a set of correction curves that we put into the RIP. And this all happens essentially automatically. You'll see you do have to point and click a little bit and move some files around, but it's a fairly automated process using our ProofPass wizard and SAi. And we basically generate a correction curve that then gets put into the RIP. So here's again just a really quick slide to illustrate the importance of working with what we refer to as a known good print condition. The G7 specification allows us to be both accurate and precise. So if we look at the middle target here, by aiming for G7 and knowing exactly where it is, we can hit it again, as I said, over and over and over again with a good spectrophotometer and a good piece of software like ProofPass. A lot of linearization routines are very precise. They're just not accurate. So they're on the left side. They hit just as tight a target, but you don't necessarily know exactly where you are, and you don't know if you can always get back to that same point. And then a lot of print systems, just like offset presses and things like that, generally tend to be accurate, but not precise. So again, we can aim for a target, but we don't necessarily hit it as closely as we want to. The cool thing about G7 and inkjet is we're both accurate and precise most of the time. I talked about the data collection and the color verification. If we're doing the verification routines to make sure that we're still achieving good color, then we're going to identify problems, we're going to analyze those problems, and we're going to prevent problems and verify them with the customer. Right here, this is the only time I'm going to show you part of ProofPass is essentially a two-part system. It's a web-based interface where you set up your data sets and you do long-term analysis of process control data. So here's a web interface to some of our process control data. We're not going to get into that today just because of time, but it's where I talked about the process control part of this being essentially free. If you use ProofPass to calibrate and then to verify on an ongoing basis, you have all this data that's getting pushed up to the web that you can go in and analyze, or you can have an outside color expert analyze, or you can have a vendor analyze, all kinds of reasons to potentially get back to that data. And I just wanted you to know it would be there. Let's talk about delivering on the promise. These are at least 3 of these. One may not. I think one of these is a test print I made in my office. The other 3 of these are actual G7 prints, which were measured and then submitted to Idealliance for G7 conformance. And they're on materials, I don't remember exactly which is which, but I know there's 2 fabrics there, both dye sub. One is direct dye sub. In other words, we print directly to the fabric and then heat transfer. One is printed to transfer paper and then sublimated to the fabric. One is a banner material and one is like a photo paper. So, and you can see, you can tell which ones are fabric because you can kind of see through them. But if you just kind of try and cancel out the white points visually, if you just look at the grays and some of the actual colors, they're pretty darn close considering that we've got, we're mixing substrates, we're mixing ink systems, we're mixing printers. These were produced in 3 different facilities. So there's a lot of variables, and yet what we like to talk about is a common visual appearance. Perfect match? No, but definitely common visual appearance. This is just another example, a little more extreme almost. These are all dye sub samples. They're printed on, I think we've got 3 different metals here. So, these coated metals that we sublimate typically photographs to. And then in the back right, the one that's really bright, that's a ceramic tile. So you're getting a lot of fluorescence there. But even with that, again, now these are profiled as well. So they're G7 calibrated and profiled. But, very common visual appearance, again, considering the variety of substrates that we're working with. So, all right. Spot colors. All right, so it's a gray balance methodology, but it's a methodology that includes verification and process control. So if we're gray balancing or calibrating to a known good print condition, and we're good at it, we're going to basically get essentially the maximum gamut that you can get out of a printer within reason, and then we're going to be able to, because it gives us the ability to add stability to the process, being able to recalibrate, we're going to know that we can hit our spot colors over and over again. Now, that does not mean that when I'm done with a G7 calibration and a profile that I'm going to get the exact Pantone colors that I'm supposed to get. Not necessarily. You might get closer than you're currently getting, but what's more important is if you're using a spot color replacement tool and you're adjusting a spot color, if you then have, if your color then drifts and you use the recalibration routines in ProofPass and rebuild your profile, you should be right back to where you were, and you should have more consistency and control even of your spot colors if you use the G7 methodology. So what's the return on investment for a system like this? Basically, you're going to hold a print quality advantage over your competitors. You saw the consistency of color across multiple substrates and ink systems. And since it's a solution that costs less than a few dollars a day, you're going to recover those costs by producing fewer off-color jobs each month. and you'll reap the benefits of profits because your customers will see you as a high quality printer provider who can maintain consistent color. So, all right, I think we've probably all seen just about enough slides for one day. I know I've talked through enough because I'm much more of a hands-on guy. I'll leave this slide up just for a second, let you know what we're going to do. This is how you can reach us if you want to know more about ProofPass that we're going to be talking about, or you just want to ask questions about ColorMetrix G7. Feel free to call, email, whatever works for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close the PowerPoint. And back here, we should have my Windows session. There we go. So this should look familiar to most of you because I know that we've got an audience of SAi users, or at least a lot of you are. I should have asked that question, but too late now. I should have done a poll question for SAi owners. So here's my SAi production manager for Flexi. And this is where we're going to start. And I'm going to basically dive in and show you how I would essentially create a G7 calibration and a custom profile to go with it. So the first thing you need to do is you need to go into your setup, default job properties. There it is. Okay. Now I've already got one set up, which I called G7. And for those of you who have SAi, you probably know how to do this, but you can click through all of these tabs. The one that matters most to me from a G7 perspective is I need to go to the third tab over, which is the color management tab. And for this part of the process, I need to create a job properties that has no color management. So I need to make sure that this is set to no color management because we're going to do a whole bunch of fun stuff in ProofPass that requires the RIP to be doing as little as it can possibly be doing. So you would have setups, you would have settings that look like this. Again, for those of you who haven't used this, you can then, you can save this and you can decide which parts of it you want to save. So you can essentially go in, you can put a name in up here. I've already created one. I've called mine G7. And again, the most important part is make sure that you're on your color tab. You have no color correction. And then on this tab, just verify that your curves, if you look at all, like right now we're looking at all of them, and it's just a nice straight line from corner to corner. It's always good to look at that and just make sure that for some reason there's not an adjustment curve because that's what we're trying to do. All right, so let me get out of there. So once we know that's set up, what I'm doing today is most of the work we've done with SAi was in partnership with Muto when we helped them create their color verify software. So what I've got, I have access to something called a Muto virtual printer. So I've set up my Muto virtual printer here. And so I'm not necessarily connected to a physical printer today. So some of these printing might seem to go really fast and things like that. I've created a simulated environment so we can get through this in an hour. Typically, if you've never done this, you need to set aside probably a couple hours to create your first custom profile, maybe a little longer. Once you're good at it, probably 90 minutes to create a custom profile, unless you want to, really make a fancy profile. And then it might take a half a day or a day. It just depends how much you want to do. But today we're going to try and get through this in our 1 hour. So we're going to use our virtual value jet. So it's essentially a value jet 1624 for all practical purposes, just so we know what's going on here. Here's what our ProofPass wizard looks like. I've already connected it to the internet. I've already updated my data. I'm not here to sell you the software necessarily. I'm much more interested in showing you the G7 functionality. So again, because we're simulating, I've already got things set up. I'm going to tell it to go in and do a G7 calibration. So this is like the third step in the wizard. Normally you would start the wizard up, you'd get our splash screen, you'd pick your data set, and then you would get to this screen. All right, so those are very mundane things though that I can talk anyone through once they bought the software and want to understand, or they can read the manual. So we've got a bunch of settings. These are the default settings. I'm going to go straight with default settings for today just to keep things really simple. Again, a screen with some settings. We're going to go with the defaults. They work almost every time. All right, so here comes the first part that I think is really important. We have our own primary ink restriction chart, is what I call it. It's going to look just like what you see on the screen when it prints. And it allows me to decide what level of ink saturation just for my primaries that I want to have. And the cool thing about this is if I set these right here, I don't need to set that total area coverage thing at the end, which can be very complicated. I can just spend some time here and get my CMYK primaries right. The cool thing about our chart is that it also includes red, green, and blue. So you can look at how those things are printing as well. This honestly could be an entire webinar, again, just on how to properly interpret this chart. So for right now, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to generate it. And I'm putting it I've already created one, so I'm just going to overwrite the one that was there. And then I'm going to go over to SAi. And I'm going to open that folder. It's just a folder on my, actually I don't want G7 testing. I want desktop. Where'd it go? SAi webinar, there it is. Okay, I want this one right here. All right, so there again is what the target looks like. This is 100% cyan, 100% magenta. This is 50% cyan because back here in ProofPass, I set these at 100. So if I had a printer that wasn't going to be too saturated and I knew the ink wasn't going to run off the page, I could start at 100. I could visually print it, visually evaluate it, and then go back into ProofPass and set those settings. So let's go back into job properties and just make sure. Okay, so we are in G7. That's good. Just double check that we have no color management turned on. That's fantastic. We would send that to our printer. We would print that. Once it was printed, we would visually evaluate it, hopefully in a light booth under good lighting conditions. And then we would go in and we would put in, you know, what might be, I don't know, I'm just going to put some that I run into regularly. Actually, it would be the other way around. That would be like 60. That might be 65. This might be 65. This might be 85. Something like that. So we're going to put in whatever our visually assessed ink restrictions are. The system also does have the ability to do what we call auto ink limiting, kind of an advanced feature that I can talk about with anyone who moves ahead with us if they choose to. I can give you a lot more details on things like that. The next step is to print our initial calibration target. It looks like this. Again, it's asking us where we want it to go, and it's going to put it where I've told it to go before. So I've created essentially what I've done here is I've created a folder on the desktop just to keep all the files I'm going to be using during my calibration in one place that's easy to find. And now it's just reminding me that I need to send this to the rep before I can measure it. So I'm going to go back to my rep. And there's my calibration target. I'm going to open that. Again, it looks like that. I like to be really careful. So again, I'm going to go back into job properties. I know this is repetitive, but anyone who's worked with software knows that sometimes it does things you don't expect it to do. So there we go. No color management. Let's send that one. So what's going to happen is that's going to print. And once it's printed, ProofPass wants it to measure it with an I1 because that's the instrument we support. We also have this cool ability, at least I do. It'll eventually be released, but I've got some beta software here. It allows me to go in and just import a file, which I previously measured. It's called a CGATS file. Anyone who's worked with data before, with spectrophotometers and such, this is a kind of standard file format where you can transfer color data around. So what I'm about to do is I just simulated taking my I1 and measuring the entire target, which doesn't take very long, but I was just trying to make sure we could get through this. And I have to measure a 500 patch profile target in a couple of minutes because I couldn't find a way to get around that step. So trying to get around the steps I can and just make sure you see what happens. So it tells me it's done measuring. I would click next. It tells me that the next thing it's going to do is it's going to generate my initial set of calibration curves for the rip. And it tells me a little bit about, you know, if you're a G7 person, it tells me a little bit about what I can expect. It did see, look at these ink limits. Remember I put in 85? So it's made some minor adjustments. It's saying, you know what, to get a little better gray balance, I'm gonna tweak those limits a little bit. There is a, one of the options, we could have told it not to change those ink limits no matter what, and there's lots of good reasons to do that, but it's also nice to give it a little bit of room to move if it wants to. And then for those of you who know G7, here's some of the metrics that it's going to spit out. I'm going to talk more about those once we actually print and measure our next target. It tells me that my curve's going to look something like this, and that's cool. So that's what my curves are going to look like right out of the box. So I click OK, and it's telling me I'm going to generate this bigger verification target. I'm like, okay, go ahead and generate it. So now it's generated. It wants me to print it. And there's a couple versions of this. See, this is the no curve. I don't want the one with no curve. I want the one that actually it doesn't have the words no curve in it. And that's because we put the curve right into it. So that curve I showed you on the screen is already built into this image. So what's kind of cool about this is, again, we go back into job properties, and I'm going to keep repeating this. We have no color management turned on. So there's no curve in SAi right now, but there's a curve in the file that we're sending to SAi. So it's essentially simulating the curve and not making us go through a bunch of extra steps until we're sure we're where we want to be and have essentially a G7 calibration. So again, what do? We print it. When it's done printing, we go into the software, we measure the target with our I1, or if we got the cool beta version, we can just go in and say, load my verification data. So you can see that, and that's what it would look like. It would populate like that. All right, so here, there's a little more information here. So G7 is a combination of two things. It's your black results and then your CMY overprint results. And what you ultimately want is you want the word pass right here and the word pass right here. Well, we are not passing. And I could spend an hour just talking about these numbers, but for simplicity's sake, we're not passing. And we're not passing by quite a bit. So we want to have, like, this number right here, this 5, is supposed to be 3 or less. This number right here is supposed to be 1.5 or less, and so on and so on. So we're not quite there yet. It's not horrible, but we're not there. And if we were to look at our curve, there's the curve we printed. Here's the curve it wants to make. So curve we have, curve it wants to make. Not huge differences, but differences nonetheless. And that's called iteration. So what we want to do is, it's like, okay, we're not there. We want to get closer. Please iterate. So what it just did is it essentially generated another version of this target with this new curve built into it. So what we need to do to be sure is we need to go over to Job. We need to grab that file again. We need to double check our job properties, right? So we're going to go up here and we're going to click Send. And then guess what we're going to do? We're going to measure it, right? So I'm going to import. There we go. And this is the data I'm using is actual data. I'm just importing it versus measuring it. And so basically what happened was, with one iteration, we went from failing to pass and pass. So I mean, that's it. We're done. We have now achieved a gray balanced calibration that we can bring into the SAi color management module. So the next thing we do is we click OK, because we don't need to iterate anymore. And then the other thing we can do is we can say something like baseline. And remember, I talked about the web-based interface. I'm not going to show you the web-based interface. There's not time for that today. But what's going to happen is if I click next right here, that measured data, that baseline data, is going to get pushed up to the website, and it's going to allow you to set that then as your baseline by which you will compare future verification measurements. So the cool thing about process control is you got to have a baseline. Yes, we're aiming for G7, but we're aiming for a version of G7 we know we can hit on our printer, and that means it's that sample that I just pushed up. So we need to make sure that we stay within a certain tolerance or delta E of that sample. All right, enough about that. And at that point, basically, we're done with ProofPass. So I'm going to close that just to get it out of our way. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so let's go back to SAi. So for those of you who've built custom profiles with SAi, some of this is going to make a lot of sense. For those of you who don't, I'm going to go as slow as I can and make sure we can get done, but fast enough that we can get done. So we go into Setup, Color Profiler, sorry, and we're going to create an ICC output profile. At that point, it wants us to verify what printer we're working on, what settings we're working with, things that hopefully, if you're using SAi, you know how to fill these values in, and if you don't, hopefully your dealer or your printer manufacturer will help you. We're just going to refer to this as SAi Webinar G7, just so we know what we're looking for. We'll click Next. All right, this is where I was saying, because we set our ink restrictions our own way, we can just skip this step. This is how SAi would set your primary ink restrictions, and it works. It's I've done it both ways. I'm not saying it doesn't work It's just there's some advantages to doing it with ProofPass G7, some of which I've explained and some of which hopefully I'll explain as we go on. And then, again, built into SAi is this ability to linearize. And that's great. You can use this system. Again, it works. There's nothing wrong with it. It's harder to necessarily maintain it and get back to it. So instead, what we do is we import. So we need to tell it we're looking for a text file. We need to go to our desktop. We need to go into our SAi webinar. And then somewhere in here, there it is, import curve data.sai.text. We try and make it easy. So we're going to pull that in. So what we essentially just did is instead of having to print and measure the target, we've already done all of that. And we even went through an iteration to get a better gray balance. And what's cool is if we go in here and we look at these curves, they should look sort of like the ones that we saw in ProofPass, right? And they do. It's the same general shape. So it's like, oh, cool. It picked up all my data. Fantastic. So we click Next again. And remember I talked about total area coverage. We do not need to worry about total area coverage. And the reason we don't have to worry about total area coverage is if you saw those curves, they didn't go to 100%. We've already restricted how much ink can get down on the page, and the profile will do the rest for us. All right? So again, this is a step we get to skip. And then we have to print our ICC, a target that we can generate an ICC profile from. So we tell it what instrument we have, and I do have an X-Rite i1 Pro 2 plugged in. And for some reason, I have not been able to get this menu option to work. I should have probably called someone from SAi, but I took the easy way out. What we're going to do is we're going to print the smallest target. And obviously, printing a bigger target does give you a more accurate profile and all of those things. But we would print that target. Again, cool thing about SAi, when you print that target, you can't even get back here, but it does all the ripping and printing for you automatically. And then what you have to do is measure it. And this is the part that I'm not going to lie, if you're doing it with an i1, it's just not a lot of fun. So what I'm going to probably have you may hear Shelby talking to me in the background. If there's any questions I haven't been able to answer, while I'm taking these measurements, I will try and answer some questions, assuming I can get this thing to calibrate. There we go. So I do have to measure 23 rows now, so it's going to take me a minute or two. But for those of you who haven't used an i1, basically you line it up on the target, you press the measure button, you drag it across that particular row. If it worked, it's going to go ding dong. There we go, and you can see it fills in the values for us. Are there any questions I should answer, Shelby?
Not yet.
Awesome. Now I have to figure out what to talk about while I measure. Like I said, this is the part of generating custom profiles that honestly nobody likes. If you can afford it and it makes sense, I highly recommend some type of an automated instrument. I don't have one in my office because honestly, I don't build a lot of profiles in my office. I typically build them on site for clients, and I typically do recommend that they buy something like the I/O table that can go with the i1, and there's a whole bunch of instruments out there that, not a whole bunch, there's several instruments that can automate this process. But I've also found with the SAi RIP that this small target, this I don't think it's even 500 patches, this target makes a pretty darn good profile. I was just showing Shelby a print I made getting ready for this webinar of a picture I took myself in Hawaii a week ago, and I made it. I printed it with this small target, and I was very impressed with the output quality. So
was that taken with an iPhone, Jen?
That was an iPhone 5S picture, SE, yeah. So it's got the better camera, but yeah, it's and it's just printed to a little Epson 4000 in my office. So it's nothing high tech, and it's I'm very impressed with what SAi can do with this small target as a color management guy. It might not satisfy a true fine artist, but it's a great starting point for sign work and banner work and things like that. I've also been told by some people smarter than me that you don't always want more data points in a profile, that at some point you actually begin to introduce what they call noise into the target. One of the Muto engineers told me that there's a point at which too many data points actually can potentially make a profile a worse profile. So all right, we're getting there, just about halfway done. And I like this interface that they put together too for SAi, because it allows you to see what's going on. You see what the color is supposed to be and what's measured. And you can see how the white boxes fill in with my actual measured data. And it doesn't match up perfectly, but if you make a really bad measurement, it's usually pretty obvious that you've done so. If all of a sudden you have a yellow patch and a green box, that's a pretty good indication that something went wrong. Okay, we're getting there. Just a few more rows to measure. I will tell you that actually taking measurements like this, I've often joked that it's kind of like doing a high wire act without a net, because Murphy typically finds his way into this situation. And I probably shouldn't have said that with 2 rows left to go. I guess I have 3 rows left to go. All right, I'm going to measure my last row here. And when that's done, all right, awesome. So when that's done, what we can do is we can click Next. And here's some settings that you can change for the generation of your ICC profile. Again, as a starting point, if you don't necessarily know what these are, I recommend leaving them alone. If you know what they are, then you can make some changes. I'm a bigger fan of version 4 profiles versus 2.1. I will sometimes play with the total ink area coverage here, just because I know that on certain ink systems and certain medias, this is a good place to play with it. It's trial and error thing. Black start point, start at 0. You can always push it up to 5, 10, 15, depending on your droplet size, pretty much. But it's always a good idea to start at 0 and see what you get. And that's essentially where black starts to replace your 3-color overprint. So then you just click generate. It's gonna kick off a profile for us. Takes a couple minutes. It's actually pretty. Again, I think SAi is pretty quick at this, and we're running on about a 4-year-old Mac here in a VMware window. So I guarantee you'll probably get faster results if you're running on a dedicated PC somewhere. So you can see it's not too bad though. Some rips do take longer, so it's another area where I feel SAi's got some advantage. All right, so my profile is now generated. So if I click Finish, what do I do with it? This is always the big question. What do I do with it, Jim? Well, if you have some kind of a test image to print, which I just realized I don't, and it doesn't really matter because we're not going to print anyway. We're just going to grab. We're going to grab our ink limit. Well, we're just going to grab one of our test targets. We're going to go into Job Properties. And what we're going to do is we're going to slide back over to that color tab. And now we want to use color correction. So what we're going to use is our SAi webinar. And it's going to be the media we just created. And all of the settings. Hold on 1 second here. I have to sneeze. All right, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that these settings come up pretty much as they looked when we built the profile. The place that a lot of people get tripped up here is in the advanced color settings. I always recommend switching from swap to Grackle. So, and even if you use the 2006 or the 2013, for most people, those are virtually identical. I can talk about the differences offline with anyone who wants to know why they're different. But just switching from swap to Grackle, you increase your gamut size. And again, it's a different conversation. Please just believe me. And then I also recommend the relative colorimetric rendering intent. And again, this is because my world. I come from a world where we're trying to achieve this common visual appearance across multiple printers and medias. And relative generally does a better job of that, and also the Grackle profile that helps me get there too. You can see that depending on the file you've opened, there's things you can select here and not select here. With RGB, I'm a big fan of Adobe RGB. It's a bigger gamut. Some people prefer to leave it as sRGB. That's fine too. But in general, you want to play around with these settings a little bit and get what works best for your shop. If I was coming in to do a G7 certification, these are the two settings that are most important to me most of the time. Sometimes I change this from relative to absolute, but I generally find it works better in relative. And I have other consultant friends who thinks it works better in absolute. And my guess is we just work with different RIPs more often. So these things do change depending on RIPs you work with and such. So you'd click OK. You'd send whatever it was to the RIP and print it. And voila, you'd have a gray balanced G7 print. You can do things like you can print the, well, I should have done what I should have done. Hold on. So what I could have done is I could have gone back to this no curve version of the SAi calibration target, right? So if I were to grab that, because remember now, this is the same target we printed and measured earlier to create our curve. But this version of it has no curve in it. So if I went in here and on this one said used color management and go to Grackle and do relative. And if I printed this, and I didn't really prep for this because I could have printed and measured this. If I printed and then measured this, I could see if after profiling, I was still in G7 compliance. And I can tell you that with SAi, you are. I mean, I've done this enough times to know you are. If anything, if you go back to that screen I popped up earlier where it showed you the two passes, and then you looked at the numbers, if anything, you not only do you pass, you typically pass even better. So whatever SAi is doing in their color management preserves gray balance, and if anything, enhances it, at least with the Muto line of printers that I've got a lot of experience with. And I think I have run out of things to say, which is perfect because I usually do like to leave 15 or 20 minutes for open questions. Shelby told me that so far we haven't had any. So let me see. Let me pop this up and look at it myself. Oh, well, I see some questions. Or did you?
No, then mine is not showing up.
Oh, all right. Well, I have a bunch of questions. Let me see if I can run through these and answer them for you guys. This is perfect.
Sorry about that. They didn't pop up on mine.
That's fine. Not a worry. It's probably better this way. Okay, so someone started out by asking me about dye sublimation, both fabric and hard surfaces such as Chromolux. I have a lot of experience with it. I'm not sure what you necessarily want to know, but I can tell you that the G7 process works exceptionally well with it. I kind of my color management practice outside of our software business, my color management practice focuses real heavily on the dye sublimation space and the UV flatbed space. So I've kind of interjected myself into what I call industrial print. And I actually work with one of the larger dye sublimation ink manufacturers. Those 4 samples I showed you were from their demo room, which is G7 Master Printer certified. So yeah, this process works just fine on Chromolux and on fabric. I've personally made, well, I've got sitting right in front of me, I've got a mouse pad with a picture of my cat on it that I made the profile for, and it's dye sub, and it looks great. So it definitely works. Is it true that our eyes don't see a difference within 5 delta E? No, that's not. Well, let me qualify it. That's typically not true. Anyone who spends a significant amount of time with color can see between 1.5 and 2.5 delta E, and in grays in particular, that number can come down under 1 because the eye is very sensitive to grays, especially light grays. So that's not necessarily true. Now, heavily saturated black, no, you probably can't see a 5 delta E difference. Someone just shopping in a store who has very little color experience, yeah, 5-6 delta E is probably about what they see. So there's some truth to that, but it depends on the. Oh, Kevin, yeah, I didn't realize I'd probably answered your question. So, possible to get a copy of this video. Yeah, I should have told you guys that. Assuming the technology doesn't fail me, we will be saving a recording of this and publishing it on our website under the webinars area. This is a big, long one. It might take a little while to get it ripped and put up there, but it will. It'll definitely be up there sometime next week, hopefully. Yeah. Does ProofPass work with an onboard I1 scanner? No, it does not. ProofPass, the only onboard instruments that ProofPass works with is the SpectraView from Muto. So, once a profile is made per media, will you hire? Yes. Well, so here's the cool thing. Let me read the whole question. I'm sorry. Once a profile is made per media, will you ever have to remake this profile? The answer to that question is hopefully not, but at some point, yes. But in the interim, let's say a year, 2 years, you can just do the recalibration step of ProofPass, import those new curves into SAi, and then click over to the generate profile page, and you should just be able to regenerate that profile. We've done that at the Muto showroom, and it worked out really well. I mean, because again, this is where, remember, G7 is both, it's a known good print condition, so it allows us to be both accurate and precise. So when I recalibrate to G7, I have brought that printer back to a very, very similar color position that it was when I built the profile. So I shouldn't have to reprint and remeasure that target, which, remember that time when I was trying to fill the space? That's the most time-intensive part of it, is actually printing and measuring that target. And it takes a while to print it too, because it's a lot of patches. So hopefully that answers that question, at least enough that you know what I mean. Do you need a specific kind of spectrophotometer for Flexi? Well, Flexi supports a lot of instruments, and I'll let them answer that question offline. But for ProofPass, we only support directly the i1 Pro 2 in hand scanning mode, and or the onboard SpectraView from Muto. So, have you found problems with some fabrics due to the lack of the i1's lack of a polarizing filter? It drives me crazy. I get it. I understand that because of the UV brighteners that are in the fabric. Depending what i1 you have, if you have an i1 Pro 2, you can put it in M2 mode. It does require you to measure 2 or 3 times for each row of measurements, but and that basically is the equivalent of the UV cut or the polarizing filter. So, how important are the heat settings before printing the ink limits and having the correct when printing the measurement chart when using this process? If we're talking about like an eco-solvent printer that's got heaters in it, it's very important. I know, like I said, I've done a lot of work with Muto, and they have those guys at the showroom know what all those settings are supposed to be. I think they publish some of them on their website, but yeah, it's very important. Thanks for that question, Mark. Is it true that our eyes don't see a difference? Oh, I think I already answered that one. Is your software using the ink limit in SAi, or is it just limiting using the curves? Will this create a problem? Okay, that's a really good question. It's asking what happens with our ink limits. So let's go into Color Profiler. Let's modify or resume. 1624. So here's the profile I made. Look at that. If I click back to the ink limits page, what it actually did, when it imported the curve, it adjusted the ink limits based upon the values that were in our curve. So to answer your question, it does not have SAi does not have a problem with the curves that were generated outside their environment. We worked, because we developed this in very close concert with Muto, and Muto has a very strong relationship with SAi. That stuff was all worked out, and it works really nicely. I1's lack of a polarization. Okay, yep, I think I already answered that, Kevin. Someone agrees totally on using Graco versus swap. Thank you, Kevin. Can't you increase the profile color gamut if you increase the recommended ink limit in the RIP, then limit the max percentage in the profile? Let me think about that one. Sort of. If you don't rebuild the profile, if you don't reprint the chart and remeasure the chart, then I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, to me, that's kind of a It's a workaround to building a new custom profile. The changing the total area coverage in the profile before you click the generate button, I do that all the time, and yes, it does change. It does change the size of the gamut. Absolutely. How do you keep it in calibration? That's a whole other webinar. But essentially, it's the back end of the process. So it's the printing of the verification chart, measuring it in ProofPass, getting a pass or fail. If you get a fail on your G7 settings, then you know that you need to re-import your curves and regenerate your profile. Do you only profile on SAi? Well, since SAi was very generous to promote this webinar, I'm not going to answer that question in this webinar, but that question is either answered on our website or you can shoot us an email and I'll discuss what other RIPs we may or may not work with. So if after creating the profile you are not matching Pantone colors very well, what next? Well, okay, matching Pantone colors is a combination of many, many things. It's going to have to do with your substrate. It's going to have to do with your inkset. It's going to have to do with your printer. It's going to have to do with your RIP, all of the above. So there's only a certain whatever that combination of things is, there's only a certain percentage of the Pantone colors that you're going to match, and it's never 100%. So if you're talking about that you're really close or you're close enough that you think you just need to adjust it, I am pretty sure, I know Mark's on this call, there are trainers for the SAi RIP that can show you how to use the spot color toolkit in SAi to tweak a spot color and hit more precisely exactly what you want to do. That's outside the scope of this webinar, but I know it can be done, and it's a very good question. I have a 6-color printer, CMYK plus orange blue. Well, you know, most profiles are still only 4-color. The orange and the blue typically are used by the RIP to hit spot colors. So, you know, and I've never done it with SAi, so I don't know the answer. I don't think SAi builds end color profiles. If it does, someone can correct me, but I'm pretty sure it still is building CMYK profiles and just using the orange and the blue to improve its spot color toolkit. I could be wrong, but I know that G7 is a 4-color process, so we're only going to build curves for CMYK. And that's really what should be affecting your gray balance for the most part anyway. So I don't necessarily know the full answer to your question. Feel free to email me and we can definitely work with SAi to figure it out. What's the address for the website? The video will eventually be posted on colormetrix.com. And then up at the top in our menu bar, there's a webinars link and it will be in there. Thanks, Jacob. Good question. Does ProofPass work with the Barbieri LFP? No, it does not. Well, it might because we can import the CGATS file. So if Barbieri can generate a CGATS file, we may be able to read that. So I would have to test that. So the answer is maybe. How would you recommend structuring the build for a latex 36? Yeah, that's a tricky one. Timothy, please contact me offline. I'd be happy to discuss that with you. Yep, and I knew it was a 360. Thank you. How are ink splits handled on printers? Well, okay, so we're talking about light inks. So like light cyan, light magenta, light black. That is typically handled by the RIP and is part of the RIP driver. So it should not directly affect. It's kind of it's a separate set of curves and cutoffs. And it should not affect the generation of a G7 curve. It has not in any case that I've ever played around with it on multiple RIPs. So if you know of a situation where it is causing an issue, I'd love to hear it because I believe it could. I just haven't personally experienced it. This is another question about other RIPs we work with, and I'm not going to talk about that on this webinar. Can this system help us get a good profile out of our Mamaki JV300 8-color with the bulk ink setup? It should. I guess I'd have to try it, but my guess is yes. It definitely should. Does G7 profile work well with custom? Again, this is a question about custom spot color mapping. The G7 functionality should not change that one bit because it's once a profile is built, it's built. And what SAI has done is a really good job of plugging in the data that we create in a very SAI way. They just allow us to create it outside of the SAI system. All right, so I have now answered all the questions that we had in the queue. We've got about 5 minutes left if anybody wants to throw another question up there. Otherwise, I'm going to give you guys a minute or two. Otherwise, I'm going to pop this back up. We had some people ask. So there's our contact information again. Feel free to call me. Feel free to shoot an email to info@ColorMetrix. Feel free to visit ColorMetrix.com with or without the /ProofPass behind it, and you can get more information there. And I guess with that, since I gave plenty of time and no one else has asked a question, I'm going to say thank you very much, all of you, for attending. We're glad you made the time on a Friday afternoon to join us, and we look forward to working with some of you in the future.